Okay, welcome everybody. Good afternoon, hope you've had a nice lunch. Welcome to the Government Construction Playbook Overview session. My name is Lorraine Hayes, I work at NEUPC, and alongside my colleague Sarah, who works at NWUPC, we will be here to support you throughout the session. Just before we hand over to our speakers, I would just like to go through a few session etiquettes that you may have seen on previous sessions, but I'll go through them again. We welcome comments and questions, but on this particular session, due to the time allocated, the speakers would rather maximise that time. And they have said any questions that we fire through in the Q&A section, we will pass them on and they will respond to them shortly. The session is being recorded and it will be placed on the YouTube channels and the Hoover platform later. Please do not worry, you won't be on camera or recorded, just the people that are talking today. So yes, that's my bit done. What I'll do is pass you over to Fergus Aiken and Steve Baker from East Riding Yorkshire Council. Over to you, gentlemen.
Right, thank you, Lorraine, and thank you to the NEUPC and NWUPC for inviting us to chat to you today about the Construction Playbook. Just, if I can, it's working, right. So we're both here, as well as from the East Riding Yorkshire Council, we're also involved in the Yorkshire and Humber Your Hub construction frameworks that have delivered today over £2.5 billion worth of projects for over 90 clients, including many universities. And we're talking today about the Construction Playbook. And some of you may remember that June of last year, Boris announced a policy when he did this announcement at the same time about infrastructure funding being made available and new funding for construction generally. And that was a policy about better, faster, greener delivery of projects. And one of the pillars of that policy was the Construction Playbook. So the Construction Playbook set up a steering group that met from July last year through to December when it was published. And one of my roles is the chair of the Local Government Association Construction Strategy Group. And under that role, I was invited to join the Construction Playbook steering group, which included reps from various government departments, a lot of people from the industry, and I was there to sort of make sure that public sector outside of government, general public sector, local authorities, universities, etc., was taken account of as much as possible in a government document. The playbook itself looks at the procurement and project life cycle, and it sort of fits around that. It has 12 chapters and it's based on a lot of previous work. And it's also based on 14 key policies. And we're actually going to focus on the key policies today. I'm just struggling a little bit because my down arrow isn't working, so I'll try and do it on the mouse, which isn't quite as good. So these are the 14 policies that we're going to be talking through. And because I'm still on the construction steering group, because since publication in December, we've still been meeting, but we're now discussing the rollout of it, how it's working with industry. There's not a major contractors who are part of the steering group. And the training, currently training for it is for industry and for government departments, but they are discussing rolling out that training further to other areas of public sector, just as ourselves who are here today. So these policies go from one to the other, as you see, and the intention today is I will go through the government's view on each of them, and then Fergus is going to feed back on the wider public sector view and how it affects us. Does it affect us, or are we different? The overall aims of the playbook, it's all about innovation and using innovation. There's a lot on longer term arrangements, but for me, that's not particularly new. Latham, Egan, etc., back in the late 90s, were on about collaborative arrangements, etc. So there's a fair bit in there to do with that. MMC standardisation generally. those areas that there's some real benefits in delivering faster and greener and doing those areas. But at the same time, if you're MOJ and you're delivering prisons across the country, if you're Highways England and doing lots of gantries and bridges, if you're Network Rail where you're doing standard platforms on various stations, then they work really well for you. But how compatible they are to smaller clients is something, I suppose, that's up there to be debated. What benefits can we get from those areas? And they also cover contractual arrangements in the playbook. Financial assessment of suppliers, obviously been in the news on and off. Carillion, a couple of years ago now, was the biggest casualty and the effects of that. So they've tried to address that in how they do financial assessment of suppliers. And generally, safety is an issue. Whole life carbon with climate change, etc., addressing how we deal with that. And also promotion of social value, whether that's employment and skills, helping communities, looking after wildlife, etc. And as it says on the bottom of this slide, the playbook is mandated for central government. It's not mandated to the rest of the public sector, it's not mandated to universities, but it is there as good practice. And when you look at the playbook, you'll see at the end of each chapter, they have a summary of what that chapter addresses, plus lots of really good links to up-to-date guidance, up-to-date websites. So it's just good as a general handbook to dip in. If you're unsure of an area like financial assessment of suppliers, you can go in, look at the chapter and find a link to the latest guidance. So as I said, we're going to go through each of those policies. And what you'll find is that they roll from one to the other, they're all linked. So the first one is pipelines. And one of the things industry discussed at the steering group meetings was the need to have good pipelines 3 to 5 years ahead. So that is part of the playbook, and that is what the government is looking to do. And the reason for that is contractors need to plan. If there are certain trades that have to be trained up because we haven't got enough capacity, then they have to make sure those people are going through colleges. If the supply chain needs to invest in certain resources, then the pipeline allows the major contractors to make those investments and make those plans. Over to you, Fergus.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. As Steve said, I'm just going to quickly cover some practicalities of the playbook. So in terms of pipelines, I think long-term pipelines are great, but it's true that it's easier said than done, and perhaps easier for central government who have sort of greater visibility of the programs. I mean, some of the issues I've sort of noted on the slide. Users can be guarded about releasing pipelines wishing to retain their options. Dates and values can be unreliable, but definitely, a welcome initiative, and especially if it stops, some knee-jerk spending that often happens in the run-up to the end of the financial year. So, yeah, positive, Steve.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think pipelines do work better for government because they have their major programs of work, and for a lot of smaller public sector organisations, you might have the odd flagship project, but your general bread and butter construction is done on annual budgets, and it's quite difficult to set up the pipelines that the major contractors seem to expect. So just moving on to the second policy. This is about the market health and capability assessments, and link back to pipelines, that when the contractors know the pipelines and the work coming up, they can develop those skills, they can look at that they've got the capacity to meet those demands. They can also start investing more in the new technology. And if they know the type of works that are coming up, it's the innovation that they can start looking at as individual companies that they can then offer to clients. And as part of that chapter, there's a link to market management guidance notes as well that is helpful. Fergus.
Yeah, I think big smiley face at the bottom. I mean, innovation's a good thing, but I do anticipate a reluctance where people, have sort of tried and tested methods. Comparing alternative technologies can be complex. Also, bidders, if you've got three bidders putting forward innovative ideas, it's quite a resource for them. So possibly might want some, reimbursement for that effort. They can bring added risks, especially if you're, trying an untested methodology or technology. So just a word of warning there. But yeah, definitely another positive as far as we're concerned. Steve?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose innovation is something that probably quite appeals new technologies to universities as well, because you have a good link there. And as a public sector officer, I always, and this is a personal view, I always like to be on the second wave. So you have the new technology developed, and on the very next wave, following after when it's been tested, because it's public money. But that's just a personal view to do innovation, depending on the project. So longer term contracting, again, you're back to collaborative arrangements. Historically, and even recently, all the reports by government point out that if you don't have good partnering contracts, you don't have good relationships, then the programs tend to overrun and you get more claims. And you also get the industry more certainty. So this thinks back to the other two policies we've just been through. It is good for MMC. With MMC, there is a volume problem. We'll probably mention this a few times in today's presentation. Department, you can get factories set up, you can get the runs that you need in factories to get the benefits from MMC and sort of platforms, etc. For smaller public sector organisations, that's more difficult to achieve, although one way of doing that is project bundling, where you put them together. Fergus?
Yeah, again, a bit of a uncertain image at the bottom there. Are pros and cons if you are putting all your eggs in one basket, for example, maybe with an alliancing arrangement. And those types of arrangement, you do need to think about competitive tension if there's only one company involved. And again, we're all about giving work in our local areas. So there is a bit of a tension there. So and Steve, we do frameworks. We've been doing frameworks for many years, and we see that as a good way of doing these longer term arrangements, but retaining our option to have competition with a number of different suppliers. So yeah, good idea, but just some practical issues that I've raised there. Steve, we'll probably have to watch your time a bit with getting through all these 14.
Yeah, fine. Thank you for the reminder. Okay. So digitisation, rationalisation, demand, etc. So again, this links back to the previous one. To get the really good benefits of collaboration, public sector, universities could look at shared requirements and doing something together and working together. And so that can give you the standardisation across a range of public works. This promotes more platform solutions from factories, etc., because you can get those runs, and from those runs you can get the efficiencies. Not totally convinced about the greener bit, because I know I've been chatting to Cambridge University, Dr. Jennifer Schooling there, and she was mentioning to me that I should be careful because not all factories are green factories and not all platforms are necessarily green, which I thought was a really good point to make. But the presumption that overall is in favour of MMC in this policy. Fergus?
It's quite a challenge, isn't it, to get different organisations, coming together and pulling. I mean, it's hard enough to get our own individual organisations. UPCs, perhaps you're maybe well placed to support this. In terms of MMC, I mean, we've touched on it already, and in fact, we're sponsoring a PhD student at Leeds Beckett, looking at the issues as regards MMC, in terms of maturity of the sector, both on the the demand and the client side. But yeah, I think if we are moving towards MMC, there'll have to be a look at this rationalising and coming together of programmes wherever possible. Steve?
Right, policy 5 is further embed digital technologies. So anyone in construction will be very familiar with BIM and government rolling out BIM, and linked to BIM and technology is government soft landings. A lot of buildings nowadays, and even other infrastructure assets, can have inbuilt smart technology, and it's very important that obviously when you take control of that asset as a client, that you fully understand it. And that's where the soft landing, the handover following the completion of works is important between the contractor and the client. And the other thing that they're flagged up is this concept of digital twins. Just aware that colleagues from universities here today are probably more au fait with digital twins than we are. My background's a civil engineer, but this is where you do modelling of your project, so you can appreciate how it will work in practice. Whether so on a simple level, modelling of the ventilation, the heating, etc. in a building, especially when you're looking at green technology in those buildings. Fergus.
Yeah, again, we welcome this, initiative as with many of them. But our view is there's still a long way to go, really, to realise the full benefits. And often, the construction stage embraces BIM, but it can often fall down when the models are handed over to the operations stage. Steve, back to you. Next one.
Thank you. When we first met as the Playbook Steering Group, it was all about the ECI, which I think is a term more of us in construction familiar with, the early contract involvement. And as part of the discussions, it is quite obvious that it's the ESI you need, it's the supply chain. Because when you're looking at any sort of opportunities, whether it's savings in programme, in construction mechanisms, in innovation, then it is the supply chain where that experience is, where that expertise is, more than in the tier one. And the tier ones in the group were very much promoting that. We need the supply chain there to get those benefits. They were flagging that up. As part of that, it's recommended that you have a PIN notice. Again, this is about giving adequate time to contractors to be ready for the procurement and the projects. And solutions should also consider whole life carbon. The new carbon reduction code by the Cambridge Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction was published earlier this week, so it's no longer a draft. And they've actually got their launch event. I probably shouldn't tell you, it's because it's happening now. So if anyone goes, I know it's because you're now nipping off to go to the launch of that. And we're involved, we're actually sponsoring a carbon reduction PhD at the moment. It's one of the 2 PhDs your hub is sponsoring. So this isn't just aimed at tier one. It is very important that we should involving the subcontractors and the suppliers. Fergus.
Yeah, definitely welcome this one. 2 points I'd make though. One is if you do want that engagement before you go out to market, the points I've made on the slide is just be conscious of equal treatment and not giving any supplier an unfair advantage. Then when you've got maybe you've got a negotiation ongoing, you do need good management collaboration to get the best out of those those further down the tiers. Steve, we're almost at 18 minutes.
Right, okay. Outcome-based. So this is about, outcome specs have been around for many years again. So it's not new, but it's very much promoted in the playbook that really to unlock innovation and drive your continuous improvement, we should be thinking more about outcome specs and when are they appropriate for projects. And part of that is the whole life value. For most buildings, for example, the biggest cost is the running cost of the building. It's not the construction bit. And so it is thinking about the whole life value of a project and not the actual capital cost up front. And again, it's platform-based approaches can give you benefits. And the Innovation Construction Hub, they're a body who are funded by government, and they're promoting the value toolkit. It's something they've developed, and that gives you an idea of the values you require. It's a free toolkit to use. Beta testing is currently going on at the moment, and that helps in developing the outcomes and working out what you as a client, what you want, what are your actual outcomes, as opposed to thinking about the building based on previous experience. Fergus.
Yeah, outcome-based approaches, I wouldn't necessarily say they're suitable for everything. So I'll put the example of windows on there if you want to match the windows you've already got on an installation. Can be quite complex to evaluate the tenders, looking at the different proposals, easy to miss things, creates ambiguities, potentially difficult also, to assess like for like in terms of things like quality. But yeah, and where appropriate, good for encouraging innovation and can provide good value. Steve?
Benchmarking and cost modelling. So the coverage in the playbook is this. It sort of applies to everyone, but a lot of the wording is more about how government operates, because they have something called should cost modelling. But essentially, it's when you're doing your estimates, etc., and looking at the cost and thinking about the programs and how you deliver it. It's looking at your previous jobs, taking account of them. The interesting bit about this is central government's asked to refer any bid that's less than 10% than below the average to Cabinet Office prior to accepting it. Fergus, I'll let you comment on that.
Yeah, I would have said 10% lower than the average is often within the normal spread pricing that you get. So I wouldn't have necessarily seen that as necessarily out of the normal. Also, I think most of us are, when we normally do a cost estimate, it's always based on historical information or cost benchmarks anyway. But in these current times, it's really quite difficult to be looking, a year or two ahead. So that's become far more difficult to estimate with any great precision at the moment. But yeah, good focus on whole life costing and whole life carbon within those assessments, which is welcome.
They also recommend looking at your delivery models. How are you going to procure your project? How are you going to manage that project? And looking at analytical evidence about that. The value profile links back to the Construction Innovation Hub that I mentioned on a previous slide, and their value toolkit. That's where you develop your value profile. And it's taking account of risks, client, market factors, etc. So there's a number of delivery model approaches. The type of client you are and the type of project are factors as well on what's the best delivery model for an individual client.
Yeah, Steve, another smiley face for this one, but probably more written specifically for central government, but definitely worth looking at the headings and the model and the methodology that they use. So yeah, definitely recommend that. Next one.
And again, linked to the model, the effective contracting. So this is thinking about the forms of contract, NEC, JCT, etc. The boilerplate modern clauses. Government were asked by contractors to have standard clauses across all departments, because what they found was different departments have different clauses, and that affects the risk and that affects the tendering. So they now have standard boilerplate clauses that all departments should be using, which is probably good for us to have a look at and see if there's anything there we can learn. KPIs, again, it's nothing new. The government has a fair bit on the Cabinet Office website on the new project scorecard. And part of that is using it. So people who score poorly will probably not be allowed to apply for future procurements until they can show they've changed their ways. And then flexibility, there's a framework appropriate as an alliance, etc. Fergus.
Yeah, as I've commented, Steve, I think this section seems to reflect, what we all do, or it's very similar. I quite like the fact there is quite a bit of flexibility in there, both in the form of contract, in the methodology that you can use. Yeah, there are some good elements. Obviously, another emphasis on promoting this continuous improvement. But one thing we do sort of focus on is, better run tender exercises, and we've got some guidance on that. I think, Steve, we've got our own guidance as well from our hundreds of tenders that we've looked after over the years. So, as well as the government guidance, have a look at our Your Hub guide to what a good tender looks like.
So risks, rolling on from term, risk allocation, looking at risk management. Who's best placed to look at the risk and hold the risk and the risk part, the money you need for that risk? And it recommends joint working before construction. So that's working with the contractor, working with the supply chain, thinking about the risk. And I think if you're a client who has a big program of work, often there's a fair few risks that you're probably better to manage and keep to yourself, because the likelihood of them happening, if it's remote and you're looking at your overall program, then you save money. Whereas as a one-off client doing something that's a bit different, you may prefer to let the contractor price up that risk. So it's definitely horses for courses, I would say. Fergus.
Yeah, Steve, we see a lot of risk dumping, don't we? Rather than this, sharing and allocating to the right party who's best to manage it, and as you've put in bold there, and actually bear the risk. The final point on this one I'd make is we've seen it also where people have a project risk register, and they'll agree a transfer of risks that actually conflicts with the NEC contract terms, for example, maybe relating to ground conditions. So that's one that has to be watched. I think we're in the last 5 minutes now, Steve. So
okay.
2 or 3 slides to go.
Yeah, pricing and payment mechanisms. So this is just thinking, linked to fair payment as well, government's fair payment policy. As public sector, we all have to pay within 30 days anyway. But does the contractor really pay the supply chain? Should you look at a project bank account, something like that, to make sure the supply chain is being paid? Unlimited liability. I was surprised to see that. I don't think I would ever manage to get that from the contractor, not unlimited. But obviously, the more liability can affect tendering. So who's best placed to take the liability and what is required? And a recognition that contractors do need to make a profit, a fair profit, and that's why they are here. That is their business. Fergus.
Yeah, I think we'll move on, Steve, from this one, because as I've said there, I think it mostly reflects what's happening on the ground from our experience. Yeah,
fine. Financial standing. I mentioned Quillian earlier. There are other contractors who have gone under, so it is important that we check. And the latest guidance that from government is in the playbook with the links. And assessments do need to be tailored to specific projects, etc. The trouble with assessments, as we're all aware, is on the whole, they're backwards looking, they're based on accounts that a contractor pays an accountancy firm to produce to make them look good, which is why you have to do ongoing financial monitoring on all projects. Fergus.
Yeah, no, I agree, Steve. I think this is a good one, and they've got good guidance here. One thing they are focusing on, maybe something we don't do as much as we should, is your first point about looking at the firm's ability to pay their supply chains promptly. So there'll be a greater emphasis on that one. Back to you, Steve.
Yeah, and the final policy is resolution planning. Unfortunately, suppliers do go under, and it isn't always their fault. They can have bad payers. Their clients can go under and they don't get paid. So it is important, as part of the previous policy 13, thinking about bonds, parent company guarantees, those insurance policies, project bank accounts. If you're paying the key supply chain, then worst case scenario, your tier one goes under, then at least you can carry on working with that supply chain, or it's easy to do so. So it's looking at the service continuity plans as well that suppliers have done. And again, the boilerplate clauses shows it's just flagging them up that government's produced that we can all review. Fergus.
Yeah, I think much of this is already being done. This service continuity plans, I think, important with the cyber attacks we've been seeing of late, as well as COVID. But yeah, smiley thumbs up on that one, Steve.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for listening to us today. I mean, generally, we welcome the Construction Playbook. We welcome and support its aims. I see it as a brilliant handbook that, as someone who procures projects for a local authority, who manages projects the same way a university does, it's great to have everything I need in one place with all the links to the guidance documents. And my final point would be your frameworks are already well aligned with the playbook. We follow the policies anyway, which was a relief to us when it was published, obviously. Fergus, any final points before we finish?
No, not especially, other than to say thanks for joining us today. Sorry, it's been a little bit rushed. We hope you've given you a fairly quick overview. As was mentioned at the beginning, any questions and answers we'll be happy to respond to in writing afterwards. But no, many thanks for listening in, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a good conference, everyone. Okay.
Are we on time?
Yes, you are indeed. That was very, very effectively done. So that clearly concludes the end of our session. And as Fergus mentioned, if you want to post any questions throughout the afternoon on the Hoover platform, then we'll ensure that they're passed across to Steve and Fergus and they can still be answered. So thank you to both Steve and Fergus for your time today, and I hope that everybody found the session beneficial. The next two sessions that follow this at 1:35 are internal stakeholder engagement and managing insolvency and administration in the supply chain. So if you head back to your agenda to log on to either one of those sessions. Also, don't forget that you've got until 3 p.m. to enter the many different competitions and the scavenger hunt that are ongoing throughout the day. And also, please ensure that you make time to stop by the exhibitor booths throughout the afternoon. And that's it from me. So thank you to everybody for joining the session, and thank you to our